Good day, everyone. Julian Benoit again for the third lecture on South African paleontology, the Origins of Life series. So today we are going to look at history of science during this lecture entitled The First South African Fossil Hunter. So as usual, you can contact me using my email address that you can see here at the bottom or through the forum down the lessons page. So today we are going to look at history of science. So what those lecture of the origins of life helps you to understand is that life originated on Earth right after it was formed, and life is formed by the same atoms and the same particles that the ones that were generated during the origin of the universe. So life is made of the same matter than the rocks, and life is just a special kind of rocks. Actually, it's just a special kind of rocks with a particular way of interacting with each other. So these rocks have a special chemistry with each other that make them what we call alive. So now you know this, but how do we know? The history of science is how do we know what we know, and so today will be about learning how do we know what we know. That's where the history of science steps in. And that's why it's interesting to look at the history of science. So South Africa has a very rich fossil record, and this is, for example, Homo naledi, one of the most recent big discovery that was made in South Africa near Johannesburg, in the cradle of humankind. And this slides gives you an idea of what kind of cultural importance, how culturally important are these kinds of discoveries. So it's just a bunch of international articles and even a YouTube video that you can find on the internet talking about Homo naledi. So you may think that when people talk about Johannesburg, they will talk about the crime, they will talk about insecurity, they may talk about corruption. No, actually, people who talk about Johannesburg overseas talk about the cradle of humankind and what you find, what discoveries are made in the cradle of humankind, and the scientists in Johannesburg at the University of the Witwatersrand who studied these discoveries. So here, for example, there's a French journal titling about Homo naledi. Here there is the Japan Times from Japan, an article in Russian about the new skull of Homo naledi called Neo, and here a video of the top 20 scientific discoveries of the century. And you can see Homo naledi is right here standing next to Neanderthal. So first you can see that this quite popular channel that doesn't only talk about science. When they talk about science, the most interesting scientific discoveries they think are both paleontology related, and one of them is proudly South African. So you can see that paleontology holds a very important place in the cultural landscape, and particularly South African paleontology internationally, like at a global scale. So now let's look at the famous South African fossil hunter. One of the most famous South African fossil hunter was actually from Scotland, and his name is Robert Broom. He lived at the beginning of the previous century, and well, half at the beginning of the previous century and half at the end of the century before that. And he discovered many mammal-like reptiles from the Permian Karoo. And at the end of his life, he also discovered Mrs. Place, which is the oldest, which was the first adult Australopithecus skull ever found. So Robert Broom made a huge contribution. He basically started South African paleontology. And after him, James Kitching, who died quite recently, was also a great fossil finder. He also worked both in the Karoo and in the Cradle of Humankind, and discovered thousands and thousands of species of fossils, and described hundreds of species. And if you look at the Wikipedia page of James Kitching, he has a Wikipedia page and is credited as nothing less as one of the world's greatest fossil hunters. So he was recognized as one of the greatest fossil hunter of his generation, and there are a lot of stories about him finding fossils where nobody could find them, including Antarctica. So that's how good James Kitching was. But these famous South African fossil hunters were not the first to find fossils here. Well before them, the first reported case of fossil finding on the South African soil was made by the Dutch settler, the very Dutch settlers that settled the Cape Colony in 1652. So just before the Cape Colony was founded, the Arleim shipwrecked in Table Bay, and the people dug to find water. They dug a borehole to find water, and they found fossil, and they reported it in a book published in 1652, which is also the date where the Cape Colony was created. So it was the first geological study of the Cape and the first mention in the written literature of the discovery of a fossil on the South African soil. But what about before writing was imported in South Africa? Because of course there is a lot. I mean, life did not started with with writing reports in South Africa. So probably people did find some fossils, and there are a lot of reasons which we could believe that people did find fossils in South Africa before the Cape Colony was created. The first is because people were there. There was a lot of people living in South Africa before the Cape Colony was created. And we know they were there because we have the Florisbad skull, which is 260,000 years old and belongs to an archaic form of Homo sapiens. So it's our species, just with a morphology that is a little more primitive, but it belongs to our species. So our species have been present in South Africa since at least 260,000 years old, and evolved there into diverse groups. So you can see that's a genetic phylogenetic tree of the Homo sapiens family. So you have different populations of Homo sapiens whose genes have been analyzed to create this tree, which is basically like a genealogy. So it's like here you have the common ancestor and the different branches diverging from that common ancestor of all Homo sapiens. And you can see that actually you have the Khoisan here, and here you have Central African people, West African people, East African people, and here the non-African people. So you can see that the root of the evolutionary tree of Homo sapiens is deeply rooted in Africa. All of the early diverging group of Homo sapiens are Africans, and actually non-Africans, including Europeans, Americans, Asians, people living in Australia, they are all just a subset of the East African people who went out of Africa through the Arabian Peninsula, sometimes around 80,000 years ago. So the major part of genetic diversity of the modern human genetic diversity is African, which indicates a deep African root. And this is supported, as I was saying, by the fossil record. So this, and it's probably even Southern African because you have the Khoisan located just there. So the Khoisan and the Central African here indicates that it's probably in the southern or middle or central or southern part of Africa that humans originated. And it's supported by most of the fossil research and most of the genetic analysis. So people have been in Southern Africa arguably for thousands of years. That's the big idea. That's the take-home message of that slide. People have been there for thousands of years, for thousands of generations. And these people were not, even though their cranial morphology still retains some primitive features, they were not primitive in any respect. They were actually as intelligent as we are today. This is evidenced by the artifacts, archaeological artifacts that were found in the Blombos cave, for example, dating from 100,000 years old to 80,000 years old. So those seashell that were turned into beads shows that they were wearing necklace, and this engraved piece of ochre showed that they could think in an abstract way because they could engrave shapes that did not represent anything particularly. So if they could think about abstract shapes, it means that they were thinking beyond the utilitarian thinking. They were thinking beyond what was useful to their survival, so they were intelligent, just like as we are today. So there were people in Africa, and they were just like us. They were curious, they were artists, they were thinking people. And meanwhile, South Africa, was already packed with fossils. So this is the paleo sensitivity map that shows you with a shade of colors the richness of the South African ground in fossils. And the more it is red and the richer it is. And you can see that a solid 1/3 of the country is covered with rocks that are very rich in fossils, with rock indicated in red on the map. So, and you can see there are a fair bit of orange areas that are also moderately rich. So yeah, a solid 1/3 of the surface of the country has a lot of fossils inside. So you have this cocktail, may I say. You have a wealth of fossils that were already there 300,000 years ago, and 100,000 years ago, they were already fossilized. These fossils are millions of years old. They are way older than the earliest human. And you have a long history of human occupation in Southern Africa. What does that give you? That gives you a lot of pre-colonial and prehistoric, even before pre-colonial time, you have prehistoric time. And even there would be fossil findings in Southern Africa, but in Africa in general also. And there are evidence that the early populations in Southern Africa pre-colonial populations in Southern Africa were interested into geological items. So first, there is a huge archaeological record of indigenous mining, indigenous geology. So people before colonial times were already digging into mines to find gold and to find diamonds and to find coal. And we know that also the Khoisan, for example, were interested into geological items such as these rocks, which are called the fulgurites. So that's what happened when lightning strikes in the sand. That creates a fulgurite, that type of rock. And interestingly enough, the Khoisan calls that rock the lightning stone. So they knew that these rocks were formed by lightning into sand. And this is from the Middle Stone Age. This is a piece of quartz that was found in a grave, and not anywhere. It was found in the orbit of the person who was lying in the grave. So that piece of quartz was carved into a sharp point and placed intentionally into the grave. So that's another example of interest into geological items. So, but these are only anecdotal example. But do we know exactly when humans become capable of finding fossils and became curious about fossils? And when we peer into the fossil record, you find very old evidence of interest into fossils. So this is an example from Europe. It's 200,000 years old. It was found by Homo neanderthalensis. So not even Homo sapiens, another species of the genus Homo, Homo neanderthalensis, the Neanderthal man from Europe. And this Neanderthal man from Europe found a piece of siltstone with a seashell in the middle and start carving a stone tool around the seashell so that in the end, the fossil seashell is located in the middle of the handle of the stone tool. And that's absolutely amazing. It shows that an Homo neanderthalensis, a Neanderthal man or woman, found a fossil, that seashell here, which is from the Cretaceous. It's 100 million years old. It was already a fossil at that time. They found it, they carried it on purpose to their camp and start carved a stone tool around that seashell just for the beauty of it. And that's absolutely amazing. So that's one of the earliest evidence of interest into fossils in the fossil record. And it's from a species that is not Homo sapiens, which means that at least people have been able to find fossils and were interested into fossils in Homo sapiens, in Homo neanderthalensis, and by incidence, since the last common ancestor of these two species, which lived 400,000 years ago. So we can reasonably assume that people have been interested in fossils at least for 400,000 years ago, for 4,000 years old. So that's quite interesting. And we also have possible examples from Homo erectus, the possible example of fossils that were carried on purpose by Homo erectus, so almost 1 million years from now. So these fossils that are, by the way, these fossils that are carried on purpose from the place where they are found to the place where ancient humans lived, we call them manuports. Manuports, M-A-N-U-P-O-R-T-S, manuports for manually transported items, manuports. So, and in Africa, so this was an example from Europe, but in Africa, there is also a fair archaeological record of indigenous paleontology and prehistoric paleontology. And we worked together with a team of South African, but also Canadian and American researchers to collect as many examples of indigenous paleontology in Africa as possible. And we made a paper out of it. So if you're interested, you can contact me and I will send you that paper by email if you want to read it. It's everything that we could possibly find on indigenous paleontology in Africa, but doesn't mean that it's everything that existed, but it's at least everything that has been documented in the literature. So now, what are those examples of indigenous paleontology in Africa? The oldest example is a 300,000 years old Homo sapiens that lived in Erfoud in Morocco. So this Homo sapiens, this is the skull, the reconstructed skull of the archaic anatomically archaic version of Homo sapiens that lived 300,000 years ago. So it still retains some primitive characters like the thick bony eyebrows. but it's Homo sapiens in every other respect. And this early Homo sapiens found this fossil, which is an orthocerid. So the orthocerid, remember, it's a seashell that lived between the Paleozoic to the early Triassic, sorry, and this orthocere was found by this Homo sapiens and carried on purpose to the cave where it was living, and that's where the archaeologists today found it. So found that orthocere. So that orthocere was not found in its original deposit. It was found where archaic Homo sapiens have taken it. So it's a manuport. It has been intentionally transported, which means that Homo sapiens transported it for a reason. And the possible reason for that it's because, well, it looks quite like a penis. So, and it was probably used in a fertility, in some sort of fertility ritual. At least if we don't admit that they were just finding that funny, they just did not find the shape funny at all. But yeah, we don't know why they carried these fossils. But one of the hypotheses is that it might have been used for a fertility ritual of some sort. And what is even more funny when you think about it is just because it's an orthocere, so you can see that's, if you compare to the regular orthocere that you find in Morocco, the Triassic orthocere that you find in Morocco, you see that the top here is actually this part here, and you can see that this is the suture line between the two chambers. So remember, listen to, that's how you identify an orthocere. It's a straight shell with simple sutures, and there is a central siphuncle. Remember, the central siphuncle is also typical of orthocerids. So you have to imagine that right in the middle of that part, there was a tiny hole like this, which made that piece even more like a penis. So that's quite a funny occurrence, and that's actually the earliest fossil that was ever discovered by a member of Homo sapiens, 100,000 years before Homo neanderthal carved that very nice piece of shirt. There were Homo sapiens already carrying fossils around, even though we have no clear idea why they did that. So now what about South Africa? South Africa also has a record, an archaeological record of paleontological activity, if I may put it like this way. So the first fossils that we know were discovered in South Africa were trilobites. So the trilobites, remember, they are the organisms with 1, 2, and 3 on the other side, lobes, and they are little arthropods with the cephalon, the abdomen, the thorax, sorry, and the pygidium. And you can see that some trilobites were discovered in South Africa some 40,000 years ago during the Middle Stone Age. This one, for example, it's a trilobite that was discovered in a cave in the Rauberg Nature Reserve, kilometers away from its origin, from its source rocks. So that piece of slab with a trilobite on it was carried for kilometers away from its origin site. And same thing for that one that comes from a rock shelter at Veyplas, also in the Cederberg area. It's a trilobite, an enrolled trilobite. So the trilobite is enrolled like a shongololo would do when it's threatened. So that's a protection. That's for protection. That's a way to defend against predators. So that one died in this enrolled position. And this was also carried kilometers away from its original outcrop. So these two fossils are the earliest evidence of paleontological activity in South Africa, 40,000 years ago at least. Now, one of the most popular and the best known culture and civilization, African civilization, was the antique Egypt or ancient Egypt. And actually, the Egyptian also found fossils, and they were actually worshipping fossils. Here is, for example, a pack of linen in which some fossils, some fossil bones, coming most likely from a river, because they are completely rolled and the surface is smooth. There are no angles left, so they were probably found in a riverbed. These fossil bones were all packed into these linen sheaths and offered as an offering in a temple, the temple of Seth at Khou El Kebir. So Khou El Kebir is one of those, is a place in Egypt where there is a temple dedicated to the god of darkness, Seth. And this pack of linen was found there by archaeologists at the foot of the offering chamber. So, in the offering chamber. So it was offered to the god Seth for some reason. And same thing, there are a lot of hypotheses on why would Egyptians do that, but it's well, the archaeological evidence at least say that the Egyptians were intentionally looking for these bones in a riverbed and bringing them and carefully packed them into linen to give them to their god Seth. So, and the thing is, they did not do that for only 1 or 2 fossil bones. They did that for no less than 3 tons of bones. So they collected a vast amount of fossil bones. Like, it's the first example of mass collection of fossils. 3 tons of bones given, offered to their god. So, and it's also the first evidence of a religious use of a fossil. If you exclude the penis-shaped orthocere that was probably used for a fertility ritual, because it's very tentative. It's a very tentative interpretation. But here, there's no doubt that these fossil bones were given to the god because they were found in the temple just that was dedicated to that god. Now an example back again in South Africa. So there's the story of the Griqua Mesosaurus. So Mesosaurus was discovered in South Africa in the early 1800s by a Griqua person from Griqualand near Kimberley. And this person took that fossil. So it's this fossil, which is the holotype of Mesosaurus. So it's the type specimen of the species Mesosaurus tenuidens. So this fossil was taken by this Griqua person, carried to her town, and he or she used it as a pot lid. And then some French people, the Verroux brothers, came to that camp, and probably, we don't know exactly what happened, but they probably stole the fossil away, or maybe bargain to buy the fossil. We don't have the detail of the story, so either they bought or they stole the fossil from the Griqua village, and they took it away and sold the fossil to France, to a French researcher from Paris, who described the species Mesosaurus. So it's a very sad story because we have no idea. We have no idea who was that person who found the Griqua Mesosaurus. We only know that this person was Griqua and lived near Kimberley. We don't even know if it's a woman or a man, and we have no idea when the fossil was found, because the earliest report, and it's a shame because the earliest report of the discovery of a fossil in the Karoo dates from 1827. So the earliest written report of a fossil from the Karoo is 1827. But this fossil, this Mesosaurus fossil, could be the earliest fossil found in the Karoo ever. It's just that because we have no idea when it was found exactly, well, we cannot know when what is the actual first fossil that was found in the Karoo. So that's unfortunate, and that's also a very sad example of how in the past people would just take the credit. They would not give the credit to the finder if these finders were not themselves scientists. So that's a very sad story, and we hope it will be used as a lesson for the future. Please give credits to the people who actually find the stuff. And it's even more unfortunate that this fossil, Mesosaurus, turned out to be one of the most important fossils in the world, most particularly because Mesosaurus is not only found, well, Mesosaurids are not only found in Southern Africa, they are also found in South America. And if you remember lesson 1, this was used as evidence for the existence of a big supercontinent called Gondwana. The fact that you find Mesosaurus in Africa and in South America was used as evidence of a connection between the two continents, a connection due to continental drift. So Mesosaurus historically turned out into the earliest evidence of continental drift and is now used as a textbook example of how continental drift was discovered later in the early 1900s. So yeah, that's the history of Mesosaurus and how it turned out to be one of the most important fossils ever discovered. And for us, it's the earliest discovery of a Karoo reptile. Question mark, I may say, question mark, if it was discovered before 1827. Now, one of the most intriguing and I think the most interesting case, also one of the most debated case of early fossil finding is the Mokali Cave in Lesotho. So the Mokali Cave in Lesotho, so it's a rock shelter. You can see here, it's quite a big one. You can see that person for scale. It's a rock shelter, and on the walls of this rock shelter, before that, this rock shelter is located close to a dinosaur footprint site. So here you have some typical dinosaur footprints with the 3 fingers pointing forward. That's a typical dinosaur footprints. There are a lot of them in Lesotho and around Lesotho in South Africa. And they are quite conspicuous, as you can see. So now what's interesting is that on the wall of the Mokali Cave, there is a painting, and that painting looks very, very similar to those footprints, those dinosaur footprints. Also, so that cave painting was probably made by the Khoisan, based on there's no good dating of that painting, but most of the paintings in this area are from the late 1800s or the early 1900s, maybe. The paint is quite faint, so it might be even older than that. But anyway, this is quite. This is about 100 to 150 years old painting, and it shows that the Khoisan were aware of the presence of those footprints around. And the Khoisans are known for being excellent trackers, so it would be very unlikely that they did not notice those huge footprints that are very conspicuous in their landscape, and that would be the evidence of it. Also, what is supporting this interpretation is that this motif, this kind of drawings, are not common at all in Khoisan paintings. It's actually the only occurrence of that particular shape in Khoisan painting. So it's really a unique occurrence in the archaeological record. And what is even more interesting is that the Khoisan were not the only one to do that. In Arizona, there is also a cave painting. So this is in North America. There is also a cave paint made by the Native American that looks exactly like the Khoisan painting, and that was made next to a fossil footprint site. So at the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument. So you have the footprints, and a few meters away you have the painting that look exactly like a footprint. So that would not be the only example of that kind of rock art representing a dinosaur footprint. And even more interesting, it gets even more interesting every time. So even more interesting is that this painting of a footprint was not alone. When it was first studied some 70 years ago now, there were another very faint painting right next to it. So that's the footprint, and right next to it, there were 3 silhouettes painted next to the footprint that you cannot see anymore today. They are just gone. But at that time, 70 years ago, you could still see them. And these silhouettes look very much like ostriches, and they were interpreted by the researcher who studied, by the person who studied these paintings. They were interpreted as the possible track maker. So it is possible that the Khoisan painted the footprint, and next to the footprint, painted what they think was the possible track maker. So the animal that would have made those footprints. So now, in the meantime, in the UK, Sir Richard Owen, a scientist from a British scientist, was busy working on dinosaurs, and actually he was the person who coined the word dinosaur. So he was the first person in Europe to study dinosaurs. He coined the word dinosaurs and made the first study of dinosaurs and the first reconstruction of a dinosaur. So this is one of the first live reconstruction of a dinosaur ever made, and it was made by this person, and it was in the late 1800s. So he made that drawing of Megalosaurus, one of the first dinosaurs ever discovered in Europe. So that's how people were picturing dinosaurs in the late 1800s in Europe. And that's how we picture dinosaur today. Megalosaurus here, that's how we think it looked like today, based on more material, based on hundreds of years of studies, of expertise. We are very sure that Megalosaurus looked like this. So it was not quadrupedal, it was bipedal, and it was not fat like this. It was a very slim carnivore, and it did not have its tail dragging on the ground like this. Its tail was uplifted like this. So now, if you compare how people imagine dinosaurs look like in the 1800s in Europe, and if you compare how people thought the track maker of that dinosaur footprint looked like in the late 1800s in South Africa, you can see that this picture is a lot more accurate. So first the silhouette here is bipedal, like the modern reconstruction, and you can see that the tail is not dragging on the floor. It's very short. It's very short, like a bird, like an ostrich, for example. And the silhouette is very thin, not very fat, like in the European version. So how were the Khoisan so accurate in their reconstruction of a dinosaur? Well, the answer is simple. They looked at footprints. If they looked at footprints, what did they see? They only see the foot. There's no print of the hand. It's only footprints, not hand prints. So if you have only footprints, it means you're looking at a bipedal animal, and that's why they did not paint any hands. Also, there's no dragging tail. There's no trace of a dragging tail in between the prints. If you have a dragging tail, you would have a small trench here, a small trace left on the ground by the dragging tail. But there's no trace of a dragging tail, hence the short tail on their reconstruction. So that's how Khoisan made such an accurate reconstruction of dinosaurs at a time where Europeans were thinking dinosaurs look like this. It's because they looked at the footprints, something that actually the European researchers will start doing, but much later, like a couple of decades later. So, and actually, if you think about it, even in the 1980s, if you watch any American movie, a Hollywood movie in the 1980s, you will still see the dinosaurs dragging their tail. Even though they are bipedal, you will still see them dragging their tail on the ground. So even in the 1980s, most people would believe that dinosaurs were dragging their tail, even though 100 years before that, the Khoisans already knew that it was wrong because you could not see any dragging tail track on their trackways. So that's if all of these hypotheses are true, and if these drawings are indeed the reconstruction of the track makers, then it means that we are looking at the oldest accurate reconstruction of a dinosaur ever made. And that's absolutely amazing. That's absolutely amazing. At the time where Europeans were only coining the word dinosaurs, European scientists were only coining the word dinosaurs, the Khoisans already knew more about their biology than the European did. So now, after reviewing those examples, we can ask the question, why would people collect fossils? Because it was probably not for science at that time. We are talking about pre-Western scientific people. So what would be their motivation to collect fossils? Well, there are a lot of motivations to collect fossils, and actually many of them are still valid today. Including in Africa and also in the rest of the world. And I will try to parallel those examples. So, for example, the first reason you would collect a fossil is by accident. You want to do something with your rock, and accidentally there's a fossil in that rock. You did not realize it, or you did not really care about the fact that there was a fossil. So that's the example of the pyramids of Giza. In Egypt, you have the pyramids, and the pyramids are made of a type of rock that is full of little fossils that are called nummulites. And these nummulites are like little seashells, and they were formed in the sea by single-celled organisms. And these nummulites are all fossils that date about 40 to 50 million years ago. And the Egyptian actually did not really care that there were nummulites in that rock, at least not that we know. They were just there accidentally. And still today, people are finding fossils accidentally. Like, for example, very recently in 2008, this mammalian skull, the skull of a fossil whale, was discovered in a factory, in a slab factory. So they were cutting rocks to make slabs, and in the slabs they found that there was a whale skull. So still today people find fossils without even looking for them, just because they want to make paved stones, or they want to make constructions. That's why we need, by the way, an expert on every construction site in South Africa, because when you dig the ground in a country that has 1/3 of its soil packed with fossils, you need an expert to evaluate how many fossils you are going to destroy during your construction. So, and this is a mandatory requirement in South Africa, that you must have an expert to evaluate the fossil content of your ground before any construction. The second, and maybe a more unexpected use of fossils, is medicinal purpose. So medicinal people use fossils to cure themselves from various diseases. There are evidence in Native American people. There are evidence in Asia, and actually in Asia they still use fossils to cure, as a cure. Here is that's a picture that I found on eBay. People selling fossils that they called dragon bone. Longu means dragon bone. The dragon bones are actually fossils that are turned into powder and that are sold as a cure for various things. So they put that in the tea and you drink it, and it's supposed to cure you for various type of diseases. I am not sure if that works. I am quite sure of the opposite. But my own culture in France must not laugh about the use of dragon bones in China, because we ourselves use fossils as cure. We call it lithotherapy, so the therapy through stones. Here, for example, you have a piece of fossil wood. Bois fossile means fossil wood in French. So you have a piece of fossil wood, and if you wear it as a necklace, it will help you fight procrastination. That's what's written here. So yeah, medicinal purpose is something that people have been doing for a long time. And funnily enough, all our investigations so far suggest that in Africa, people never used fossils for medicinal purpose. That's quite a funny occurrence, or absence of occurrence. But we looked at a lot of literature. We asked to many people. People say, I mean, it's well known that the Amatambo of the Sangomas are full of bones. There are bones everywhere. Here, for example, that's the ankle bone of a sheep. Here, and over here, pieces of ribs. But these Amatambos never, as far as I know, had any fossil inside. People don't use fossils for medicinal purpose or divination or things like that in Africa. We have example in Europe, in America, in Asia, but not from Africa. So if you know any example, I would be very interested. Please send me an email, because we are still working on it. The aesthetic purpose now. So aesthetic purpose, so you collect a fossil just because it looks nice. And it's probably why that Mesosaurus was originally collected, because it looked nice. It was making a very fine pot lid. Remember, that's why it was used for. And actually, you still find today people that use fossils as pot lids. So that's, for example, that's a goniatite. You can see the S-shaped suture. So it's a goniatite from the Devonian of Morocco, so the Ordovician, I think, of Morocco. Anyway, it's from Morocco, and they use that fossil as a pot lid. That's also from eBay, by the way. So you can buy that kind of fossil still today. And of course, included in the aesthetic purpose, there's the jewelry. Fossils have been used as a jewelry for centuries. You just have to find the fossils. You dig a hole in it, and it makes you a very fine bead for your necklace. We saw earlier the seashells that were used for that. Here is an example of a necklace, also from eBay. So that's a necklace made with amber, and you remember amber is fossilized tree sap. So amber is a fossil by itself, and this one also has a fossil insect inside. So that's a modern example. And in the fossil record, we have a Neanderthalian necklace. So that necklace is 40,000 years old. And you have teeth, so human teeth in that necklace. You have animal teeth, you have bones, and you have this brachiopod. That's that little shell of a brachiopod. It's a fossil brachiopod, and you can see that they made that little trench to be able to put the necklace around it and use it as a necklace like this. So this was 40,000 years ago. So jewelry, collecting fossil for jewelry is nothing new. And then you have the religious and mythological and beliefs, everything that is related to the beliefs. And the use and fossils were used for that again since a very, very long time. For example, one of the best examples is the dragon, the mythology of dragons. So they are quite rare, but in Europe you have, for example, the Klagenfurt dragon, a myth from the Middle Ages that was inspired by a woolly rhino skull, so from the Ice Age, so about 50,000 years old, something like that. So a fossil rhino skull inspired the discovery of a fossil rhino skull in 1353 inspired the history of a dragon, and actually that statue of the Klagenfurt dragon, the head is directly inspired from the head, the skull of the rhino that they found. And in Southern Africa, you have the example of the Kolumolumo or the Amakonkongo. I'm trying. my clicks are nothing like perfect, unfortunately. But yeah, the Kolumolumo or Amakonkongo is like a monster, a kind of monster that probably was in part inspired by the footprints. Why do we think this? By dinosaur footprints. Why do we think that? It's because in Lesotho, particularly, people do refer to the footprints, the dinosaur footprints, as the footprints of the Kolumolumo. And in the Transkei, there is an occurrence, one example of a bone bed, a dinosaur bone bed that was referred to as the bones of the Amakonkongo. So you have these kinds of story that might have been related one way or another to the fossil record. Another example of use of fossils that probably inspire myths is the teeth of fossil elephants, like mammoths, for example. So in Europe, there is and that inspired the myth of giant human beings. So here, for example, you have Teutobochus. It's a mythical giant from Europe, and it was inspired by the fossil teeth of teeth of giant fossil elephants that were discovered in France. And in Africa, you also have this tooth of an elephant, a fossil elephant that was discovered in the 4th century, and that was also interpreted as the tooth of a giant human being. So you have the same story more or less in Europe and in Africa using almost the same type of fossils. And there is the use for religion, stricto sensu, the use in religious rituals. So we talked about the fertility rituals with that one. We talked about the 3 tons of fossil bones that were offered to the god Seth in Egypt. There are many other examples coming from Egypt. There's also a sea urchin that was discovered in Egypt and what was offered into a temple. And by the way, that sea urchin that was found by the early Egyptians was put together with modern seashells, which means that the Egyptians knew that it was a sea urchin. They understood that this fossil, this piece of rock that is shaped like a sea urchin, actually belonged to a live sea urchin. So that's the first example of an identification of a fossil. And in Europe, you have that example. It's a grave that is completely filled with sea urchins, but these sea urchins are not moderns. They are all fossils that were collected in the surrounding cliffs in England. So there's no less than 200 fossil sea urchin in that grave. So sea urchin, you can see at they have a very special shape with their pentaradial symmetry. So they hold a special place in the beliefs of ancient people. And the last and most modern use of fossils is the scientific purpose. So you can see that the scientific use of fossil is only one of the many aspects of one of the many ways you can use a fossil. So, and of course, any textbook will tell you that the scientific use of fossils started in Europe with Georges Cuvier in France, who was the first to coin comparative anatomy, and with Charles Darwin, who coined the theory of evolution. Now, what is quite interesting is to look elsewhere than in Europe, and particularly in Africa. You have this scholar from Tunisia called Ibn Khaldun. So, and in medieval times, so a solid 500 years before Darwin, Ibn Khaldun wrote this sentence: "The higher stage of man is reached from the world of monkeys. The highest stage of man is reached from the world of monkeys. Human is descended from apes." That should ring a bell. That should ring a bell. He was the first person to hypothesize a primate origin of humans, 500 years before Darwin. Now the big question is, was he inspired by fossil discoveries? And that's where the rest of the sentence is interesting. So the higher stage of human is reached from the world of monkeys, in which both sagacity and perceptions are found, but which has not reached the stage of actual reflection and thinking. So his statement is mostly based on behavioral data. So how the monkeys lived and think and behave. And that's what makes him think that humans are descended from primates. It's because they behave more or less the same. And so that's quite interesting because first, as I was saying, it's 500 years before Darwin, but it's also interesting because it suggests that Ibn Khaldun did not base his thinking on fossil discoveries. He could have in Tunisia, because as you remember, 300,000 years ago, there are some fossils of archaic Homo sapiens from North Africa. So it's not impossible that he could have known about fossils fossil humans from North Africa, but it seems that he did not. But who knows what the future holds for the history of African science and African paleosciences more particularly. So yeah, if anything, just remember the evolution of species. I told you it's a vector of social equality, because if you know where you're coming from, then no one else is going to tell you where you come from, and no one else can instrumentalize that knowledge. And also, that shows you that the theory of evolution has no religious, racial, political, or cultural boundary. Ibn Khaldun lived 500 years before Darwin, was Muslim, lived in Africa, while Darwin was British, lived during Victorian England, and was Christian. So you can see you can end up with the same conclusion looking at the same data. You just need to free your mind from religious, racial, political, and cultural boundaries. Thank you very much. See you next time.